December 24th, 2002. A heavily pregnant woman vanishes from her home in Modesto, California. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses to a crime. No obvious explanation. Just a husband who says he left that morning for a fishing trip and returned to find his wife gone. At first, it looked like a missing persons case, the kind investigators see every day. But within weeks, detectives would uncover information that completely changed the direction of the investigation. A secret relationship. Recorded phone calls, contradictions that investigators couldn't ignore, and a series of discoveries that would transform a nationwide search into one of the most controversial murder cases in American history. As media attention exploded, millions of people became convinced they knew exactly what happened. Others believed investigators had gotten it wrong. Even today, more than 2 decades later, people are still arguing about the evidence, still debating the investigation, still asking the same question. Did Scott Peterson murder his wife and unborn son? Or did one of the most closely watched investigations in America miss something important? Because this case isn't just about a disappearance. It's about evidence, perception, media influence, and a tragedy that continues to divide public opinion more than 20 years later. To understand why, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the headlines, before the investigation, before the controversy. Back to the life of a woman named Laci Peterson. Long before her name appeared on national news broadcasts, Laci Peterson was known simply as a daughter, a sister, a friend, and soon a mother. Those closest to her consistently described someone who was warm, outgoing, and deeply family-oriented. She grew up surrounded by a close-knit family and maintained strong relationships with the people who mattered most to her. For the Rocha family wasn't just important, it was central to everything. Laci shared a particularly close bond with her mother, Sharon Rocha, and remained connected to her father, Dennis Rocha, her sister Amy Rocha, and her brother Brent Rocha throughout her life. Years later, when the case became known across the world, those family members would become some of the most recognizable voices fighting to keep the focus on who Laci was, not simply what happened to her. Because before she became the victim in a homicide investigation, she was a real person with plans, relationships, and a future she was actively building. That future appeared to be coming together. In the late 1990s, Laci met a man named Scott Peterson. The relationship moved quickly. Friends and family members described the couple as happy and affectionate. They married in 1997 and eventually settled in Modesto, California, where Scott worked in agricultural sales. To outsiders, their life appeared stable. They owned a home, they had established careers, and they seemed to be building the kind of future many young couples hoped for. By 2002, they were preparing for a major new chapter. Laci was pregnant with the couple's first child, a son they planned to name Connor. For family members, Connor's arrival represented something exciting, a new generation, a new beginning. And by all accounts, Laci embraced the pregnancy. Friends recalled her excitement about becoming a mother. Family members later spoke about conversations involving baby clothes, future plans, and preparations for Connor's arrival. The due date was approaching. Christmas was only days away, and what should have been one of the happiest periods of her life seemed to be unfolding exactly as expected. Looking back, that's one of the reasons this case continues to resonate with so many people. Nothing about the Petersons' life appeared extraordinary. There were no headlines, no public controversies, no indication that their names would soon become known around the world. They looked like thousands of other young couples preparing to welcome their first child. And that's what makes what happened next feel so unsettling. Because when investigators later began reconstructing the timeline, they weren't examining the life of a celebrity or a public figure. They were examining the life of a woman who appeared to be on the verge of a new beginning. A woman who was 8 months pregnant. A woman preparing for Christmas. A woman preparing to become a mother. And a woman whose family had absolutely no reason to believe that their lives were about to change forever. As Christmas Eve approached, nothing seemed unusual. No emergency, no warning, no indication that anything was wrong. But within hours, one of the most infamous true crime investigations in American history would begin. And by the end of the day, Laci Peterson would be gone. December 24th, 2002. For investigators, almost every major case eventually comes down to one thing: the timeline. Who was where? Who saw what? And when it happened? In the Peterson case, that process would begin with a seemingly ordinary Christmas Eve. According to Scott Peterson, he woke up that morning at the Modesto home he shared with Laci. At the time, Laci was 8 months pregnant with their son, Connor. Christmas was only hours away. Family gatherings were being planned. The couple was expecting guests in the coming days. By all appearances, it should have been a routine holiday. According to Scott, the morning unfolded normally. He later told investigators that he planned to spend part of the day fishing. Not with friends, not with family, alone. His destination was the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles from Modesto. The trip would eventually become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the entire case. At the time, however, it appeared unremarkable. Scott said he loaded his boat and left home. Before leaving, he said Laci was still at the house. He told investigators she planned to spend part of the morning walking the family's dog, a golden retriever named Mackenzie. Nothing about that explanation immediately stood out. In fact, if the day had ended normally, nobody would have remembered it at all. But it didn't. And that's why investigators would later spend years examining nearly every minute of what happened next. While Scott was traveling toward Berkeley, life in Modesto continued as usual. Neighbors carried on with their holiday preparations. People ran errands. Families prepared for Christmas celebrations. Nobody knew that events were already unfolding that would soon attract national attention. At some point later that day, a neighbor made a discovery that would become one of the earliest and most important details in the investigation. Mackenzie, the Petersons' dog, was found wandering alone. The dog still had its leash attached. For many people, that detail might not sound unusual, but investigators immediately understood why it mattered. If Laci had been walking the dog, where was Laci? The neighbor secured Mackenzie and returned him to the Peterson property. At the time, nobody suspected a crime. Nobody was thinking about homicide. Nobody imagined they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most famous criminal investigations in modern history. As the afternoon turned into evening, concern began growing. Family members expected to hear from Laci. They expected her to answer phone calls. They expected her to be preparing for Christmas. Instead, there was silence. The longer that silence continued, the more alarming it became. When Scott returned home later that day, he reported that Laci was missing. The house appeared largely undisturbed. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. No broken windows, no immediate evidence pointing investigators in a clear direction. It was a situation that law enforcement officers encounter in missing person cases across the country. A person is gone. The circumstances are unclear, and the clock is already ticking. But even during those first hours, one uncomfortable reality was becoming impossible to ignore. A pregnant woman was missing on Christmas Eve, and nobody seemed to know where she had gone. As concern spread among family members and friends, law enforcement began gathering information. Officers needed timelines, witnesses, phone records, movements, observations, anything that could help explain what had happened during the previous several hours. At that stage, investigators still hoped there might be an innocent explanation. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps Laci would return. Perhaps someone had simply lost contact with her. But every hour that passed made those possibilities seem less likely. The search for answers was just beginning. And within days, detectives would find themselves confronting a question that would shape the entire investigation. Was this a missing person case? Or was something much more sinister hiding beneath the surface? By nightfall, what began as concern for a missing woman had become an active investigation. And soon, detectives would begin noticing details they couldn't easily explain. In the earliest stages of any missing person investigation, detectives face a difficult challenge. They have very little information, very few confirmed facts, and often more questions than answers. Their job isn't to jump to conclusions. Their job is to observe, listen, verify, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. That process began almost immediately in the Peterson case. As concern for Laci Peterson grew, investigators from the Modesto Police Department began assembling a clearer picture of the hours leading up to her disappearance. Among those assigned to the case were Detective John Buller, Detective Al Broccini, Detective Craig Grogan, and Detective Al Carter. At first, there was no homicide investigation, no crime scene, no suspect. Only a pregnant woman who appeared to have vanished. The priority was straightforward. Find Laci Peterson, and find her quickly. The first 24 to 48 hours of a missing person case are often critical. Investigators know memories fade, evidence disappears. Witnesses become harder to locate. Every hour matters. As detectives began conducting interviews, one person naturally became central to the investigation: Scott Peterson, the last known person believed to have seen Laci before she disappeared. Like detectives in any major missing person case, investigators needed to understand his timeline: where he went, what he did, who he spoke to, and whether his account could be independently verified. According to investigators, Scott was cooperative during those early interviews. He answered questions, provided information, and described his activities on Christmas Eve. On paper, that might seem reassuring, but experienced investigators are trained to pay attention to more than words. They observe behavior, body language, emotional responses, and reactions to unfolding events. Not because those things prove guilt, they don't, but because they can help detectives decide where to focus their attention. As John Buller and Al Broccini later explained, investigators were constantly assessing everything around them, not just what people said, but how they said it and how they responded to the crisis unfolding around them. One thing detectives immediately noticed was the stark contrast between different people involved in the case. Laci's family was frantic, friends were desperate for information, volunteers were organizing searches. Everyone seemed focused on one objective: finding Laci. As detectives moved between interviews, search efforts, and meetings with family members, emotions were running high. People were scared, people were confused, people were desperately hoping for good news. Yet investigators later described moments that left them uneasy. Not because of a single statement, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because certain observations didn't align with what they expected to see. This is where many true crime discussions become misleading. People often assume detectives solve cases because of one dramatic clue. In reality, investigations usually develop through accumulation. 100 small observations, 100 small inconsistencies, 100 questions that refuse to go away. And according to investigators, that process had already begun. Detectives started comparing timelines, checking details, verifying statements, looking for independent confirmation of events, the same way they would in any serious investigation. The more information they gathered, the more they realized that this case might be far more complicated than it first appeared. Meanwhile, outside the investigation, the public still viewed the situation very differently. Most people saw a missing pregnant woman, a worried husband, a frightened family, and a community rallying together to help. At that point, nobody knew what had happened to Laci. Nobody knew whether she was alive. Nobody knew whether a crime had even occurred. Hope still existed. And investigators desperately wanted that hope to be justified. But as the days passed, that optimism became increasingly difficult to maintain. Searches continued, leads were pursued, tips poured in, yet Laci remained missing. And for detectives, another problem was beginning to emerge. The evidence wasn't growing. The questions were. Every answer seemed to create another question. Every lead seemed to open another avenue of investigation. And despite all the effort being poured into the case, investigators were still missing the one thing they needed most: a breakthrough. Then, as media attention intensified and search efforts expanded across California, detectives received information that would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. Because while investigators were searching for a missing woman, they were about to discover there was an entire part of Scott Peterson's life didn't know existed. And that discovery would alter everything. As the first days of the investigation turned into weeks, one troubling reality became impossible to ignore. Laci Peterson was still missing. Despite extensive search efforts, despite growing media coverage, despite hundreds of tips being reported to law enforcement, there was still no sign of her. And for detectives, that presented a serious problem. Missing person investigations often depend on momentum. A witness comes forward, a surveillance image surfaces, a credible sighting is reported, something happens that pushes the case forward. But in the Peterson investigation, that breakthrough refused to come. Instead, investigators found themselves facing an increasingly frustrating situation. The search was growing larger. The attention was growing larger. Yet, the evidence was not. Across Modesto and to surrounding communities, volunteers mobilized in extraordinary numbers. People who had never met Laci Peterson showed up to help. Neighborhoods were canvassed, parks were searched, flyers were distributed, roadways were checked. Search teams spent countless hours looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. For many volunteers, the case felt deeply personal. Laci was 8 months pregnant. Christmas had just passed. And the idea that a young, expectant mother could simply disappear resonated with people across the country. The public response was immediate and emotional. Meanwhile, Sharon Rocha and other family members became increasingly visible in the search effort. They spoke with reporters, participated in public appeals, and worked tirelessly to keep attention focused on finding Laci. Their message remained consistent: bring Laci home. Every interview carried the same underlying hope that somewhere, somehow, she was still alive. But as the investigation continued, that hope was becoming harder to sustain. Behind the scenes, detectives were processing an overwhelming amount of information. Tips arrived daily. Some appeared promising. Others quickly led nowhere. Investigators were forced to separate credible information from rumor, speculation, and misinformation. It was painstaking work, and often frustrating work, because every lead required time. Every lead required resources, and most ultimately failed to provide answers. At the same time, media interest in the case exploded. What had begun as a local missing person investigation was rapidly becoming a national story. Television networks picked up the case. Newspapers across the country ran headlines. Talk shows discussed the disappearance. Legal analysts began offering theories. And millions of Americans who had never heard of Modesto suddenly knew the name Laci Peterson. For detectives, that attention created both advantages and challenges. On one hand, publicity often generates tips. Witnesses come forward. Memories are refreshed. new information emerges. On the other hand, intense media attention can complicate investigations. Rumors spread quickly. Speculation becomes widespread. And public perception can begin moving faster than the evidence itself. That balancing act became increasingly important as the Peterson investigation grew. Law enforcement needed public assistance, but investigators also needed facts, not assumptions, not theories, facts. As January turned into February, detectives continued working the case from every possible angle. Witness statements were revisited. Timelines were refined. Evidence was reviewed again and again. Yet one question continued hanging over the investigation. Where was Laci Peterson? Weeks had passed, then months. Still no answers. And the longer the case remained unsolved, the more pressure investigators faced. Pressure from the media, pressure from the public, pressure from a family desperate for news. Every day without a breakthrough made the mystery more troubling, because people don't simply vanish, not without leaving something behind, a witness, a clue, a mistake, something. Yet despite all the attention surrounding the case, detectives still lacked the breakthrough they desperately needed. Then, unexpectedly, that breakthrough arrived. Not through a search, not through forensic evidence, not through a witness who suddenly remembered something important. It came through a phone call from a woman investigators had never heard of, a woman who claimed she had been dating Scott Peterson. And what she was about to tell detectives would change the entire direction of the investigation. Because while the public thought they understood Scott Peterson's life, investigators were about to discover there was far more to the story than anyone realized. By February 2003, the Peterson investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Detectives had conducted interviews, reviewed evidence, followed leads, and coordinated extensive search efforts. Yet they were still missing something critical, a breakthrough. Then the phone rang. On the other end was a woman named Frey. At first, detectives had no reason to believe the call would change the course of the investigation. Within days, they realized it might become one of the most significant developments in the entire case. Frey was a single mother living in Fresno, California. She had never met Laci Peterson. She had never spoken to Sharon Rocha. And until recently, she knew virtually nothing about the missing person investigation dominating headlines across California. What she did know was Scott Peterson, or at least she thought she did. According to Amber, she had met Scott in November 2002 through mutual acquaintances. The two began seeing each other. They spent time together, talked regularly, and developed what Amber believed was a legitimate romantic relationship. But there was one detail Scott allegedly failed to disclose. He was married. Not only married, his wife was missing, and her disappearance had become one of the biggest news stories in America. Amber later explained that she discovered the connection after seeing media coverage surrounding the Peterson case. The realization was shocking. The man she had been dating was the same man appearing on television asking for help finding his missing pregnant wife. Almost immediately, Amber contacted law enforcement. For investigators, this was the kind of information that demanded immediate attention. Not because an affair proves murder. It doesn't. Detectives understood that infidelity and homicide are two very different things. But what Amber was describing raised serious questions about Scott's credibility. And credibility matters, especially in an investigation where timelines, statements, and behavior are being closely examined. Detectives John Buhler and Al Brocchini quickly recognized the potential significance of Amber's information. So did investigator Beverly Valdivia. If Scott had been dishonest about a major aspect of his life, investigators needed to understand exactly what else he might have been concealing. As discussions continued, another revelation emerged. Amber told detectives that Scott had represented himself as a man who was not available for marriage because he had effectively lost his wife. That statement immediately drew attention. According to Amber, those conversations occurred before Laci Peterson disappeared. Investigators understood the importance of establishing timelines. When were statements made? What exactly was said? Could they be independently verified? These questions would become critical. To preserve evidence and gather information, investigators developed a strategy. Amber agreed to cooperate. That cooperation would produce some of the most discussed evidence in the entire case. Recorded telephone calls. Over the following months, Amber spoke with Scott while investigators monitored and recorded conversations. The recordings would later become a major component of the prosecution's case. Not because they contained a confession. They didn't. But because prosecutors argued the conversations revealed important information about Scott's conduct and statements during the investigation. One call, in particular, received enormous public attention. On New Year's Eve 2002, while search efforts for Laci Peterson continued and media attention intensified, Scott spoke with Amber by phone. During that conversation, he claimed to be in Paris, watching New Year's celebrations near the Eiffel Tower. In reality, he was attending a candlelight vigil for Laci in California. When details of the call became public, the reaction was immediate. The contrast was striking. On one side, family members and volunteers were publicly searching for a missing pregnant woman. On the other, Scott was maintaining a romantic relationship built on information investigators would later argue was false. For many observers, this was the moment public perception began shifting dramatically. Until then, much of the attention had focused on finding Laci. Now attention increasingly focused on Scott Peterson himself. Television networks replayed portions of the story repeatedly. Legal analysts debated its significance. Journalists examined timelines, and the public began asking a new question. Why would someone in Scott Peterson's position continue telling those kinds of lies? For detectives, however, the issue was more specific. Not whether the behavior appeared suspicious, but whether it had evidentiary value. Investigators remained focused on facts. What could be proven? What could be documented? What could be presented in court? As they continued reviewing the recordings and Amber's statements, they believed they were learning something important. Not necessarily about what happened to Laci Peterson, but about Scott Peterson, about the version of himself he presented to different people, about the statements he made, and about the discrepancies investigators were increasingly uncovering. The revelations surrounding Amber Frey transformed the investigation. They transformed media coverage, and they transformed public perception. But detectives understood something the public often overlooked. An affair is not evidence of murder. Dishonesty is not evidence of murder. Character flaws are not evidence of murder. If prosecutors were ever going to prove a homicide case, they needed something far more substantial. They needed evidence, real evidence. Evidence that could connect suspicion to criminal responsibility. And despite everything investigators had learned about Scott Peterson, one enormous challenge remained. They still had to prove what happened to Laci Peterson, and that would require building a case piece by piece, because the strongest arguments against Scott Peterson were still ahead. And the evidence detectives were about to present would become the foundation of one of the most debated murder prosecutions in modern American history. By the spring of 2003, investigators had spent months searching for answers. They had interviewed witnesses, reviewed records, analyzed timelines, and uncovered a secret relationship that dramatically changed public perception of Scott Peterson. But detectives understood something many people watching the case from the outside did not. Suspicion is not evidence. An affair is not evidence. Even repeated lies by themselves are not evidence of murder. If prosecutors were going to convince a jury, they needed something stronger. They needed a case. And that case would be built almost entirely through circumstantial evidence. Before examining the evidence itself, it's important to understand what that term actually means. In popular culture, circumstantial evidence is often portrayed as weak, secondary, less reliable than direct evidence. But that's not how the legal system views it. Circumstantial evidence allows jurors to draw reasonable conclusions from proven facts. In fact, many homicide convictions are based primarily on circumstantial evidence because murders often occur without eyewitnesses. Veteran prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, who successfully prosecuted numerous high-profile cases, frequently used a simple analogy to explain the concept. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Break one link, and the chain fails. But a cable is different. A cable consists of many smaller strands woven together. No single strand carries the entire weight. Instead, the strength comes from all of them combined. Prosecutors would eventually argue that the Peterson case resembled a cable. No single piece of evidence proved guilt. The significance came from the totality of the evidence viewed together. That argument began with Christmas Eve itself. From the beginning, investigators focused heavily on Scott Peterson's trip to the Berkeley Marina. According to Scott, he had spent part of December 24th fishing in San Francisco Bay. On the surface, there was nothing illegal about that, but detectives kept returning to the same question: why that location? And why that particular day? As investigators reconstructed movements and timelines, the marina became one of the most scrutinized locations in the entire case. The boat Scott used also received extensive attention. Prosecutors later argued that aspects of the vessel were relevant to their theory of the crime. Investigators carefully documented its condition, contents, and construction. Every detail mattered. Every observation was cataloged. Every possibility was examined. As the investigation continued, forensic findings became another major focus. One piece of evidence that received significant attention involved a strand of hair discovered on equipment associated with Scott's boat. According to testimony presented during the trial, forensic analysis suggested the hair was consistent with Laci Peterson. Defense attorneys challenged the significance of that evidence. Prosecutors argued it supported their theory. Jurors would ultimately hear both interpretations before reaching their own conclusions. Then there was the issue of the anchors. During the investigation, prosecutors presented a theory involving homemade cement anchors. According to evidence introduced at trial, Scott had purchased materials used to create anchors. Investigators later argued that only one completed anchor was recovered. The prosecution contended that additional anchors had been made and subsequently used in connection with the crime. The defense strongly disputed that theory. No additional anchors were recovered. No direct evidence established exactly how many had been created. As with much of the case, jurors were asked to weigh competing interpretations. Timeline inconsistencies also became a recurring focus. Investigators repeatedly compared statements, records, witness observations, and documented movements. Whenever discrepancies emerged, detectives sought explanations. Not because inconsistencies automatically indicate guilt, but because understanding those discrepancies is a central part of any major criminal investigation. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions they believed required answers. Financial issues also entered the discussion. Prosecutors examined aspects of the Petersons' financial situation and argued they provided additional context for the case. The defense challenged those conclusions and argued the evidence was being interpreted unfairly. Again, jurors would ultimately hear both perspectives. Then there were the statements Scott made to Amber Frey. For investigators, these conversations were important because they provided insight into Scott's behavior before and after Laci disappeared. The prosecution argued the statements demonstrated deception. The defense argued that deception regarding an affair should not be confused with evidence of homicide. It was another dispute that would become central during trial proceedings. Detectives also examined Scott's interactions with family members, friends, reporters, and volunteers following Laci's disappearance. Every major case generates scrutiny of behavior, how someone responds, what they say, what they do, and how those actions compare with other available evidence. Prosecutors later argued that Scott's conduct after the disappearance raised significant concerns. The defense argued those interpretations were subjective and influenced by public perception. One of the most important lessons in criminal investigations is that behavior alone rarely resolves a case. Human beings respond to trauma differently. Some become emotional, others become withdrawn, some appear calm, others appear overwhelmed. Investigators know there is no universally correct way to grieve, which is why detectives continued focusing on evidence rather than impressions. As prosecutors assembled their case, experts became increasingly important. Witnesses such as Karen Korsberg and forensic specialists, including Dr. Eric Eason, contributed testimony relating to evidence and investigative findings. Their analyses would become part of the broader picture presented to jurors, piece by piece, fact by fact, observation by observation. By this point, investigators believed they had constructed a compelling circumstantial case, but they still faced a major challenge. The most important question remained unanswered. Where was Laci Peterson? Without that answer, the investigation remained incomplete. Without that answer, prosecutors faced significant obstacles. Without that answer, uncertainty continued to shadow the entire case. Then, nearly 4 months after Laci Peterson disappeared, something happened that transformed the investigation forever. Along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, discoveries were made that would eliminate any remaining hope. The search for a missing woman was over, and a homicide investigation was about to enter an entirely new phase. For nearly 4 months, the Peterson investigation had been defined by uncertainty. Investigators were searching for a missing woman. Volunteers continued looking for clues. Family members continued hoping for answers. And despite months of work, one critical question remained unresolved. Where was Laci Peterson? Then, in April 2003, everything changed. On April 13th, a passerby walking along the shoreline near Point Isabel Regional Shoreline in the San Francisco Bay Area made a disturbing discovery. Authorities were contacted, investigators responded, and almost immediately, they recognized the potential significance of what had been found. The remains appeared to belong to a young child. For law enforcement, discoveries like this trigger an immediate and methodical response. The scene must be secured. Evidence must be preserved. Every detail must be documented. Nothing can be assumed. Nothing can be overlooked. At that moment, investigators did not yet know exactly what they were dealing with, but they understood the possibility, and it was a possibility no one wanted to confront. The following day, another discovery was made in the same general area. This time, the remains appeared to belong to an adult female. Again, investigators secured the scene and began the painstaking process of identification. What followed was one of the most devastating moments in the entire case. The remains were ultimately identified as Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. For the Rocha family, the news brought an end to months of uncertainty, but it also brought the end of hope. The possibility that Laci might still be alive was gone. The family that had spent months searching, waiting, and praying for answers now faced a different reality. A recovery had become a homicide investigation, and the emotional impact was enormous. Throughout the search, family members had continued appearing before cameras, urging the public not to give up. They had organized efforts, conducted interviews, worked alongside volunteers. Now they were forced to confront the outcome they had feared from the beginning: the loss of both Laci and Connor. For investigators, the discoveries fundamentally changed the case. Missing person investigations focus on location and recovery. Homicide investigations focus on responsibility. The question was no longer where Laci was. The question now became who was responsible for her death. And just as importantly, whether that responsibility could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The location of the discoveries immediately drew attention. The remains were found along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, the same general body of water connected to the Berkeley Marina, the same marina Scott Peterson said he visited on Christmas Eve. For investigators, that coincidence was impossible to ignore. The significance of the location would become a major component of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors later argued that the discovery supported the investigative theory that had been developing for months. The defense, however, challenged those conclusions and disputed aspects of the prosecution's interpretation. Those competing arguments would eventually be presented in court. But long before trial began, detectives were already assessing what the discoveries meant for the investigation. Months earlier, investigators had been working with fragments, pieces of information, separate strands of evidence. Now, they believed those pieces were beginning to fit together, not because of one dramatic breakthrough, but because the discoveries provided context for evidence they had been examining since December. The timeline, the marina trip, the boat, the statements, the recorded calls, the forensic findings. Investigators began reevaluating everything through the lens of a confirmed homicide investigation, and the pressure intensified immediately. The case was already attracting national attention. Now, that attention exploded. News coverage became relentless. Television networks interrupted programming. Legal analysts filled airtime with discussion and debate. Newspapers across the country carried the story on front pages. The public response was emotional and immediate. For months, many people had followed the case, hoping for a safe return. Now they were mourning the deaths of a mother and her unborn son. The emotional center of the investigation shifted overnight. So did the expectations surrounding law enforcement. The public wanted answers. The family wanted answers. And investigators knew that recovering remains was only one part of the process. The next challenge would be even more difficult. Building a prosecutable homicide case. Finding remains and proving criminal responsibility are not the same thing. One answers what happened. The other answers who is responsible. And prosecutors understood that jurors would eventually need evidence connecting those two questions. As detectives continued reviewing the case, they believed they had accumulated months of evidence pointing in a particular direction. But they also knew something else. The most scrutinized phase of the investigation was still ahead. Because now that Laci and Connor had been found, attention would inevitably focus on one person, Scott Peterson. And within days, investigators would take steps that signaled just how seriously they viewed the evidence they had assembled. The search for Laci Peterson was over. The fight to prove what happened to her was only beginning.